Welcome to Sherlock Midnight Echo, where every whisper hides a chilling mystery.
The village of Little Dorling prided itself on the punctuality of its rituals. Church bells rang when they ought to, roses bloomed according to long-established expectations, and tea was poured at 4 o'clock with a solemnity bordering on reverence. It was therefore remarked upon, quietly at first, then with growing interest, that on the afternoon of Lady Hawthorne's summer garden party the tea went cold before it was drunk. This, in retrospect, was the first sign that something was amiss. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne's house, Rosemere, stood at the edge of the village green, a gracious Georgian structure softened by climbing wisteria and the indulgent neglect of old money. The garden party had been announced weeks in advance, ostensibly to celebrate the restoration of the East Wing, though most villagers understood it for what it truly was, a social audit. Attendance was noted. Absence was remembered. Miss Jane Marple arrived precisely at 3:30, wearing a lavender hat that had seen several summers and a pair of gloves mended so neatly that only she could remember where they had once torn. She accepted a cup of tea from a trembling young maid and settled herself near the hydrangeas, where she could observe without appearing to do so. She always found garden parties most instructive. There was Colonel Arthur Bellamy, loudly recounting a war story that changed subtly with each telling. Mrs. Finchley, the baker's wife, listened with rapt attention, though her eyes flickered constantly toward the French windows. Dr. Samuel Wright stood apart, hands clasped behind his back, his expression one of polite detachment, as if he were already diagnosing the gathering with some mild social ailment. And then there was Mr. Edwin Hawthorne, Lady Beatrice's nephew, and heir presumptive, moving through the crowd with the easy charm of a man accustomed to being forgiven his shortcomings. He laughed readily, drank more champagne than was quite advisable before tea, and avoided, rather too carefully, the far end of the lawn where the servants' entrance lay. Miss Marple noticed this avoidance, though she said nothing. The butler, Mr. Thomas Bell, had not yet appeared. This, too, was unusual. Mr. Bell had served the Hawthorne household for over 30 years. He was a tall, narrow man with a solemn face and eyes that suggested he had seen far more than he ever intended to remember. Garden parties were his domain. Guests expected to see him hovering discreetly near the drinks table, correcting minor social disasters before they fully formed. When 4 o'clock came and went without his presence, a ripple of unease passed through the gathering. "Perhaps he's unwell," someone suggested. "He was perfectly fine this morning," replied Mrs. Grant, Lady Beatrice's companion, her voice sharp with certainty. "He helped her choose the table linens." Lady Beatrice herself sat beneath a striped parasol, smiling thinly and tapping her fingers against the arm of her chair. She was a handsome woman in her late 60s, her authority softened, but not diminished, by age. She glanced toward the house, then caught Miss Marple's eye and inclined her head politely. Miss Marple returned the nod, thinking how very tense Lady Beatrice's smile appeared. It was young Emily Carter, the scullery maid, who screamed. The sound cut through the murmur of polite conversation with shocking violence. Cups rattled, a spoon fell to the grass. Several guests turned as one toward the house. Emily emerged from the servants' corridor, pale and shaking, her hands fluttering uselessly at her apron. "It's Mr. Bell." She gasped. "Oh, please, someone, he's—" She could not finish the sentence. Dr. Wright moved first, striding toward the house with professional urgency. Colonel Bellamy followed, muttering about nonsense and hysteria. Lady Beatrice rose slowly, one hand pressed to her chest. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, watching the reactions ripple outward. Shock, yes. Curiosity. And something else, too. Something dangerously close to relief on more than one face. Then she stood and followed the others inside. Mr. Bell was found in the small morning room just off the servants' hall, a room rarely used except for polishing silver or sorting correspondence. He lay on the floor beside a writing desk, one hand curled as though still grasping an invisible object. His face, usually so composed, bore an expression of quiet astonishment. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. Dr. Wright knelt beside him, checking for signs of life, though it was already clear there were none. "Dead," he said softly. "Quite dead. I'd say no more than an hour." Lady Beatrice let out a low sound and sat heavily in a chair. Mrs. Grant hovered anxiously, her eyes darting about the room. "What happened to him?" someone whispered. Dr. Wright straightened. "I'll need to examine him properly, of course, but at first glance, this looks very much like poison." A murmur swept through the room. Miss Marple's gaze had drifted to the desk. Upon it lay a single sheet of paper, folded once. It had been placed carefully, not dropped. A confession, perhaps, or something intended to look like one. She did not touch it. Instead, she noticed the teacup on the corner of the desk. The tea inside had gone cold. Later, much later, when the police had come and gone, when the garden party had dissolved into whispers and speculation, Miss Marple would recall that moment with absolute clarity. The butler had heard a confession, and someone had made certain he would never repeat it. By the time the police arrived, the light had changed. What had begun as a pleasant summer afternoon now pressed against the windows in a dull, accusing grey, as though the day itself wished to withdraw from the business at hand. Inspector Harold Pritchard of the County Constabulary was a solid, methodical man with a square jaw and a habit of clearing his throat before asking questions he already believed he knew the answers to. He listened gravely as Dr. Wright explained his preliminary findings, nodded at the folded paper on the desk without touching it, and then surveyed the room with an air of brisk competence. "A regrettable business," he said. "But these things do have a way of sorting themselves out quickly." Miss Marple, seated quietly near the door, thought of several occasions when they had done nothing of the sort. The guests had been ushered into the drawing-room, where tea, freshly poured, stood largely untouched. Conversations occurred in hushed clusters, punctuated by glances toward the closed morning-room door. "I always said there was something peculiar about him," Mrs. Finchley murmured, leaning toward Mrs. Grant. "So quiet. You never know with those sorts." Mrs. Grant stiffened. Mr. Bell was the soul of discretion. Lady Beatrice trusted him implicitly. "That's often how it begins," Mrs. Finchley replied, with the air of one making a profound observation. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Gossip, she reflected, was rarely accurate, but it was always revealing. Inspector Pritchard began his interviews with the servants, assembling them in the smaller sitting room. Emily Carter wept openly, while the cook, Mrs. Henshaw, bristled with indignation at the very idea that questions should be asked at all. "Poison?" she repeated sharply. "Then it didn't come from my kit." "Chen, I'll swear to that." "No one is suggesting otherwise," the inspector said soothingly. Miss Marple noticed, however, that Mrs. Henshaw's eyes flicked briefly toward the door, toward the servants' corridor, before she spoke. When at last the inspector turned his attention to the family and guests, Lady Beatrice was composed once more, though the lines around her mouth had deepened. "Mr. Bell had been with us since my husband was alive," she said. "If he heard something, if he believed it important, he would have come to me." "And did he?" Inspector Pritchard asked. Lady Beatrice hesitated. "Only for a fraction of a second, but long enough." "No," she said, "not to my knowledge." Her nephew Edwin shifted in his chair. "Look, Inspector, if you're implying that my aunt, or any of us, had something to do with this, it's absurd. Bell was a servant. A good one, yes, but hardly someone to be murdered over." Miss Marple observed how he avoided saying the word butler, as though it carried an inconvenience of its own. Inspector Pritchard smiled thinly. "In my experience, Mr. Hawthorne, people are rarely murdered for who they are. It's what they know that proves dangerous." That remark produced a visible reaction. Mrs. Grant's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. Colonel Bellamy cleared his throat loudly. Dr. Wright stared at the carpet with sudden intensity. Only Miss Marple seemed unperturbed. When the inspector unfolded the paper found on the desk, the room grew very still. "It appears to be a written statement," he said. "Unsigned. A sort of confession." "To what?" Lady Beatrice asked. Inspector Pritchard read aloud, his voice steady. "I cannot continue to live with this knowledge. What I witnessed was no accident, though it was made to appear so. If I do not speak now, the truth will be lost forever. That's all? Edwin demanded. That's hardly a confession. No, the inspec. Tor agreed. It isn't. Which suggests Mr. Bell may have been interrupted. Miss Marple's eyes returned once more to the teacup. She thought of how carefully the paper had been folded, of how neatly the cup had been placed at the desk's edge. Mr. Bell had been a man of order. If he had feared interruption, he would have hidden the paper, not left it so conspicuously displayed, unless, of course, he had wanted it to be found. As the interviews continued, Miss Marple began to notice the small discrepancies that rarely troubled official inquiries. Mrs. Grant insisted she had not seen Mr. Bell all afternoon. Yet Emily Carter distinctly remembered him carrying a tray past the morning room scarcely an hour before the scream. Edwin claimed he had been on the lawn the entire time, though Colonel Bellamy was quite certain he had seen him enter the house briefly, looking rather flushed. No one was lying outright, Miss Marple thought. They were merely arranging the truth to suit themselves. When Inspector Pritchard finally announced that he would return the following morning with further questions, the collective exhalation was almost audible. One by one, the guests departed, leaving behind the faint scent of unease and trampled grass. Miss Marple lingered. As Lady Beatrice prepared to retire for the evening, she paused beside Miss Marple's chair. "A dreadful business," she said quietly. "You must think us a most unfortunate household." Miss Marple smiled gently. "On the contrary, my dear. Tragedy so often prefers the places where secrets are kept most carefully." Lady Beatrice's eyes sharpened. For just a moment, later, alone in her small guest room overlooking the garden, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. The confession that was not a confession, the tea that had gone cold, and above all the expression on Mr. Bell's face, not fear, not pain, but surprise, as though the danger had come from someone he trusted. Outside, the village of Little Dawlings settled uneasily into night, unaware that its quiet rhythms had already been irrevocably disturbed. Sleep did not come easily to Rosemere that night. The house creaked and settled in the manner of old buildings that remembered too much, and more than one occupant lay awake listening to sounds that would have gone unnoticed on any other evening. A footstep in the corridor, the distant closing of a door, the soft, unmistakable clink of china. Miss Marple, however, slept quite well. She had long believed that worry was best addressed in the morning, when it could be examined calmly, like a piece of knitting that had gone wrong and required patient unpicking. She rose early, dressed with care, and descended to the breakfast room while the house still lingered in a state of subdued politeness. The servants moved quietly, eyes lowered, as though any noise might summon yesterday's horror anew. Mr. Bell's absence hung over them all like a missing note in a familiar melody. Mrs. Grant presided over the table, her manner brisk and efficient. "Lady Beatrice will join us later," she said. "She had a difficult night." Miss Marple murmured her understanding and poured herself a cup of tea. She noticed at once that it was not prepared in the manner Mr. Bell had always insisted upon, brewed too long, with a faint bitterness that lingered on the tongue. Such small changes, she reflected, often revealed more than grand gestures. Dr. Wright entered shortly thereafter, looking drawn but alert. Edwin Hawthorne followed, his usual easy confidence replaced by an air of strained impatience. "I suppose the inspector will be back today," Edwin said, buttering his toast with unnecessary force. "So he said," Dr. Wright replied. "Routine, I imagine. Routine is precisely what I object to," Edwin snapped. "This is a merely matter, not some sordid village scandal." Miss Marple glanced up, her expression mild. "I'm afraid, Mr. Hawthorne, that once the police are involved, matters have a way of belonging to everyone." Edwin flushed and subsided, muttering something about misunderstandings. Later that morning, Miss Marple asked, quite casually, if she might see the morning room again. Mrs. Grant hesitated, then agreed, accompanying her as though to ensure nothing was disturbed. The room had been tidied with almost aggressive efficiency. The desk was clear, the floor polished, the air faintly scented with lavender. Only the chair, placed slightly askew, hinted at yesterday's events. "A shame to let a room grow morbid," Mrs. Grant said briskly. Lady Beatrice prefers order. Of course, Miss Marple replied. Order can be very comforting. Her eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, where a small silver clock ticked steadily. It was a trifle out of place, too ornate for a utilitarian room. She leaned closer, peering at the back. Curious, she murmured. This clock seems to have stopped at 3:20 yesterday. Mrs. Grant stiffened. It must have been neglected. Mr. Bell usually wounded. Indeed? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then it stopped not long before he died. Mrs. Grant said nothing, but her mouth tightened. Outside, the inspector arrived shortly before noon, accompanied by a young constable who looked as though he would have preferred any other assignment. Inspector Pritchard wasted little time in resuming his inquiries. This matter of the confession troubles me, he said, addressing Lady Beatrice in the drawing-room. Do you know of any incident Mr. Bell might have referred to? An accident, perhaps? Lady Beatrice's gaze drifted toward the window. There was an accident some years ago, she said slowly. A girl from the village, Lucy Harper. She fell from the quarry path and was killed. A dreadful business. Yes, the inspector said. I've read the file. An open and shut case, according to the records. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Such cases often are, she observed. And yet they have a way of reopening themselves. Edwin laughed shortly. You can't seriously be suggesting that has anything to do with Bell's death. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. I'm suggesting nothing at all. I merely find it interesting that Mr. Bell chose to write of something made to appear an accident. The inspector leaned forward. Was Mr. Bell present when Lucy Harper died? Lady Beatrice hesitated again. He was, in the house at the time. Then how could he have witnessed anything? Edwin demanded. Miss Marple's needles paused. One need not be present at the moment of a tragedy to witness its truth, she said gently. Sometimes it is what comes after that matters most. The room fell silent. It was then that Emily Carter was shown in, her face pale but determined. Begging your pardon, she said, twisting her apron, but there's something I ought to say. Yesterday afternoon, before the party, I saw Mr. Bell in the morning room. He was arguing with someone. Arguing, Inspector Pritchard repeated. With whom? Emily swallowed. I didn't see their face, sir, but I heard the voice. It was a woman's. Miss Marple lowered her knitting and listened very carefully. Emily continued, her voice trembling. And Mr. Bell said, if you don't tell her, I shall. The inspector rose slowly. Tell whom? Emily shook her head. I don't know, sir. But he sounded afraid. Not for himself, for someone else. No one spoke. Miss Marple felt the familiar, quiet certainty settle upon her. The shape of the mystery was beginning to emerge, not in facts and figures, but in loyalties and long-suppressed fears. Somewhere within Rosemere, a truth had been buried. Ed for years, and Mr. Bell, in his final act of conscience, had unearthed it. Now, it seemed, the truth was demanding payment. Emily Carter's words lingered in the air long after she had been gently dismissed. Inspector Pritchard thanked her, promised she had done the right thing, and watched her retreat with the guarded expression of a man recalculating his assumptions. A woman, he said at last. That narrows things, though perhaps not by much. Lady Beatrice sat very still. Mrs. Grant had gone pale, her earlier briskness replaced by a strained composure. Miss Marple observed them both, noting how differently people reacted when the past began to stir. Mr. Bell was loyal, Lady Beatrice said quietly. If he believed something must be told, it would have weighed on him terribly. And yet he chose to write, not speak, Inspector Pritchard replied, which suggests he feared interruption or contradiction. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, or that the truth, once spoken aloud, might have caused harm that could not be undone. The inspector glanced at her, then back to Lady Beatrice. I should like to revisit the matter of Lucy Harper. Lady Beatrice's eyes closed briefly. She was a difficult girl, she said, restless, always wanting more than the village could give her. More than the village, Miss Marple murmured, or more than she was allowed. Edwin shifted sharply. This is pointless. Lucy Harper died years ago. Tragic, yes, but hardly relevant now. Inspector Pritchard's gaze hardened. Relevance has a way of resurfacing, Mr. Hawthorne. He rose and announced that he would be speaking to villagers who had known Lucy Harper, beginning with her mother, who still lived at the far end of Little Dorling. With that, he departed, leaving behind an atmosphere of brittle restraint. As the afternoon wore on, Rosemere seemed to contract inward. Doors closed softly. Company. Conversations dwindled. Miss Marple took advantage of the quiet to walk the garden paths, pausing occasionally to admire a rose or straighten a wayward border, small, harmless acts that allowed her to linger unnoticed. It was near the old yew tree that Mrs. Grant approached her. "You're very observant," Mrs. Grant said abruptly. "For someone who appears so unobtrusive." Miss Marple smiled. "One learns a great deal by being thought so." Mrs. Grant hesitated. Mr. Bell was devoted to Lady Beatrice. If he intended to reveal something, it would not have been done lightly. "Devotion," Miss Marple replied, "can be both a comfort and a burden." Mrs. Grant said no more, but as she turned away, Miss Marple noticed how her hands trembled. Later, as dusk approached, Inspector Pritchard returned. His expression was markedly altered, less confident, more cautious. "Mrs. Harper remembers Mr. Bell very well," he said to those assembled. "She says he came to see her the day after her daughter's death, asked questions, offered condolences, and left her some money from his own pocket." "That proves nothing," Edwin protested. "It proves he felt responsible," the inspector replied, "or believed someone else was." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Did Mrs. Harper mention anyone else visiting her at that time?" "Yes," the inspector said slowly. "Lady Beatrice." A faint sound escaped Mrs. Grant, a sharp intake of breath quickly mastered. Lady Beatrice straightened. "I did what was expected of me." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently, "and yet expectations often conceal necessities." The inspector cleared his throat. "There's more. Mrs. Harper insists Lucy was frightened before her death. She believed someone powerful wished to silence her." Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Miss Marple looked toward Edwin. His face had lost its color, though he attempted a careless shrug. "Village nonsense," he said. "Grief breeds fantasies." "Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed, "and sometimes it sharpens memory." That evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she heard raised voices from the study below, Edwin's unmistakable tones, edged with panic, and a woman's lower, urgent reply. She did not linger to listen. It was enough to know that the past was no longer content to remain buried. The following morning would bring answers, she suspected. Or another tragedy, for truths long suppressed have a way of insisting upon themselves, and they rarely do so gently. Morning broke over Little Dorling with a deceptive brightness. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of Rosemere as though determined to banish the shadows of the previous days, yet it only served to make them more distinct. Miss Marple noticed this as she dressed, reflecting that guilt, like dust, was often most visible in full daylight. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Lady Beatrice did not appear at all, sending word through Mrs. Grant that she was indisposed. Edwin arrived late, his eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, and took his seat without comment. Dr. Wright ate little, his attention fixed on his cup. Miss Marple broke the silence. "It's remarkable how a village remembers," she said mildly, "even after many years." Dr. Wright glanced up. "You believe the past is responsible for Mr. Bell's death?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that the past rarely relinquishes its claims without resistance." Inspector Pritchard arrived shortly after, his manner brisk but his eyes alert. "I've had word from the coroner," he announced. "Poison confirmed. A tasteless substance, easily dissolved in tea, administered shortly before death." Mrs. Grant's hand tightened around her teacup. "And the cup?" Edwin asked too quickly. "Was it found?" "In the morning room," the inspector replied. "Washed, but traces remain. Miss Marple's." Gaze lingered on the sideboard, where the household's china stood arranged with near-reverential care. Mr. Bell had overseen that arrangement for decades. "I'd like to speak with you, Miss Marple," Inspector Pritchard said. "Privately." They walked together into the garden, where bees moved industriously among the late roses. "You've a way of seeing things others miss," the inspector said. "I won't pretend I understand how—" Miss Marple smiled. "Human nature is wonderfully consistent, Inspector. Only the circumstances change. I'm beginning to think Mr. Bell was poisoned by someone within the house," he continued. "Someone who knew his habits, his tea, his routines." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "And someone he trusted enough to accept a cup from without hesitation." Inside, tensions rose as the morning wore on. Mrs. Grant busied herself with unnecessary tasks. Edwin paced the length of the drawing room, and Lady Beatrice remained conspicuously absent. It was Emily Carter who brought word that Lady Beatrice wished to see Miss Marple. The bedroom was dim, curtains half drawn against the light. Lady Beatrice lay propped against pillows, her face pale but her eyes sharp. "You think me capable of terrible things," she said without preamble. Miss Marple took the offered chair. "I think you are capable of loyalty," she replied, "and of fear." Lady Beatrice closed her eyes. "Lucy Harper came to me," she said. "She believed Edwin had promised her something he could not give. When she threatened to expose him, there was an argument. I tried to calm her. She ran toward the quarry." "And Mr. Bell?" Miss Marple asked softly. "He saw Edwin return that evening," Lady Beatrice whispered. "He knew something was wrong. I begged him to keep silent. For Edwin's sake, for the family's, and when he could no longer do so," Lady Beatrice's voice broke. "I did not poison him. Miss Marple rose. "No," she said gently. "You did not." Downstairs, Inspector Pritchard was questioning Edwin when a sudden cry echoed from the servants' corridor. Emily burst into the room, breathless. "It's Mrs. Grant," she cried. "She's collapsed in the morning room." They hurried there to find Mrs. Grant slumped beside the desk, a teacup shattered on the floor. Dr. Wright knelt swiftly, examining her. "Alive," he said, "but only just—" Miss Marple surveyed the scene, her expression thoughtful. 2 poisonings, 2 teacups, and 1 room where confessions had been interrupted. As the ambulance was summoned, Miss Marple felt the final threads drawing together. Mrs. Grant's devotion, her fear, her opportunity. The truth, she knew, was nearly ready to be spoken. Mrs. Grant was carried out with as much quiet urgency as the situation allowed, the ambulance doors closing with a finality that sent a shiver through those watching. The morning room was left in disarray once more, as though the house itself resisted being set to rights. Inspector Pritchard stood very still, his gaze moving from the shattered teacup to the desk, then to the faces gathered at the doorway. "That makes 2, he said slowly, "and no coincidence." Dr. Wright wiped his hands. The dose was smaller this time. If she took the tea herself, and I suspect she did, it was either misjudged or interrupted. "Or," Miss Marple said gently, "it was never meant to kill." The inspector looked at her sharply. "You think she poisoned herself?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that Mrs. Grant wished to prevent something more dangerous than death." Edwin laughed harshly. "This is absurd. Are we to believe the household has gone mad? First Bell, now Grant. What next?" Miss Marple turned to him. "Fear is a powerful motivator, Mr. Hawthorne, especially when it has been carefully tended for years." Lady Beatrice was brought downstairs. Iris shortly thereafter, her frailty more pronounced than before. She sank into a chair, clutching her handkerchief. "This must end," she said. "Whatever secrets remain, they have already cost us too much." Inspector Pritchard nodded. "I agree, which is why I should like everyone to remain here until matters are clarified." Miss Marple took advantage of the enforced pause to examine the morning room more closely. The broken teacup had spilled its contents across the rug, darkening the fabric in a spreading stain. Nearby, the silver clock still stood on the mantelpiece, ticking once more. Someone had rewound it. "Who wound the clock?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Emily Carter looked uncertain. "Mrs. Grant, miss. She said it was bothering her." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How considerate of her." The inspector followed Miss Marple's gaze. "You think that's significant?" "Very," Miss Marple replied. "Mr. Bell was meticulous." Mrs. Grant admired order, but she did not always understand its purpose. They spoke then of Lucy Harper again, the name no longer greeted with resistance but with weary resignation. Inspector Pritchard laid out what he had learned: Edwin's secret relationship, Lucy's threats, the fatal argument near the quarry. No one interrupted, and Mr. Bell, the inspector continued, believed the truth had been concealed to protect the family. He meant to expose it. Lady Beatrice bowed her head. Miss Marple's voice was soft but carried clearly. Mrs. Grant knew Mr. Bell was preparing to speak. She had been Lady Beatrice's companion for years, devoted, protective, and frightened of what the truth would do. Edwin sprang to his feet. "You're accusing her." "I am explaining her actions," Miss Marple replied. She poisoned Mr. Bell's tea, not in anger but in desperation. She intended to silence him, not kill him. The dose was meant to make him ill, to delay him. In spe. Tutor Pritchard's eyes widened. "But it killed him." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "because Mr. Bell, ever conscientious, drank the tea despite feeling unwell. He did not wish to inconvenience anyone during the party." A heavy silence settled. "And Mrs. Grant?" the inspector asked. "She realized too late what she had done," Miss Marple continued. "The confession he left behind haunted her. She returned to the morning room, rewound the clock to disguise the timing, and, overcome by guilt, attempted to poison herself. Not to die, but to be stopped." Inspector Pritchard exhaled slowly. "A tragic miscalculation." Mrs. Grant survived, though she would never again return to Rosemere. Edwin, stripped of his illusions and his inheritance, left the village soon after. Lady Beatrice withdrew from public life, her authority dimmed but not extinguished, and Miss Marple, as she prepared to depart Little Dorling, reflected once more on the quiet dangers of misplaced loyalty. For evil, she knew, did not always shout. More often it whispered, over a cup of tea carefully poured. Inspector Pritchard did not speak at once. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment, gazing out at the garden where the remnants of the ill-fated party still lingered. Chairs stacked neatly, tables cleared with excessive care as though order alone might undo what had been set in motion. "You're saying," he said at last, "that this was never intended as murder?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Intention and outcome are not always faithful companions." Dr. Wright frowned. "But the poison, surely Mrs. Grant knew the risk." "She knew enough to be frightened," Miss Marple replied, "not enough to be precise. She was a woman who lived by anticipation, anticipating Lady Beatrice's needs, anticipating scandal, anticipating disaster. When Mr. Bell threatened to act, she responded in the only way she knew, by trying tea. Oh, control events." Edwin sank back into his chair, his defiance ebbing into something closer to despair. "She did it for us," he muttered. "For the family. For Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple corrected gently. "And perhaps for the idea of the family she believed she was protecting." Inspector Pritchard nodded slowly. "Mrs. Grant will be questioned once she regains consciousness, but I think the matter is largely settled." "Largely," Miss Marple echoed. "Though there remains the question of Mr. Bell's confession." The inspector glanced at the desk. "An unfinished warning." "A completed one," Miss Marple said softly. "He knew he might not be believed, so he wrote just enough to force attention, to ensure the truth would be sought, even if he could not speak it aloud." Lady Beatrice's voice was scarcely audible. "He was kinder than we deserved." Miss Marple turned toward her. "He believed that truth, once acknowledged, could still be met with mercy. That was his final act of service." The house seemed to release a long-held breath. Tension gave way not to relief, but to a weary acceptance, as though each person present now understood the cost of silence. Later that afternoon, Inspector Pritchard prepared to leave, pausing beside Miss Marple in the hall. "I don't often say this," he admitted, "but I should have been lost without your observations." Miss Marple smiled. "You would have managed very well, Inspector. I merely reminded you to look where the noise was not." As evening approached, Miss Marple took one last walk through the garden. The roses were beginning to fade, petals loosening and falling soundlessly to the ground. She thought of Lucy Harper, young, frightened, unheard, of Mr. Bell, loyal to the end, and of Mrs. Grant, whose devotion had curdled into something quietly lethal. Human nature, she reflected, rarely announced its darkest moments. It hid them in habit, in routines, in cups of tea poured with trembling hands. When Miss Marple finally departed Little Dorling the next morning, the village appeared much as it always had, peaceful, self-contained, deceptively serene. Yet beneath the familiar rhythms, something had shifted. Secrets once buried had been brought into the light, and though the truth was painful, it was no longer poisonous. Miss Marple settled back in her seat as the car pulled away, already turning her thoughts to knitting patterns and the small, comforting certainties of home. But she would not forget Little Dorling. She never forgot the places where people mistook silence for safety, and paid dearly for it. The car had not yet reached the village boundary when it slowed abruptly. Miss Marple looked up in mild surprise as Inspector Pritchard emerged from the bend in the road ahead, his hat slightly askew, one hand raised in a gesture that was half apology, half urgency. The driver braked, and Miss Marple lowered her window. "I was hoping I might catch you," the inspector said. "There's been a development, not a contradiction, but a clarification." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with polite interest. "Those are often the most useful kind." He hesitated, then continued. Mrs. Grant regained consciousness briefly. "Just long enough to speak. She asked for me, and she said something that troubles me." Miss Marple nodded. She would not wish to leave anything unfinished. "She admitted to poisoning Mr. Bell's tea," the inspector said, "just as you suggested. But she insisted she had already done something else, earlier that afternoon. Something she believed would have prevented him from speaking at all." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "Indeed, she said she had destroyed a letter," Inspector Pritchard went on. "A full confession Mr. Bell had already written the night before, one that named names Miss Marple." He closed her eyes briefly, so he rewrote it. Shorter, less specific. "Yes," and left it where it could not be missed. The inspector looked troubled, which means he fully expected interference. He anticipated her. He understood her very well, Miss Marple said gently. Better, perhaps, than she understood herself. They drove back to Rosemere together, the house now strangely hollow, as though its purpose had quietly expired. In the morning room, Inspector Pritchard showed Miss Marple a small metal waste bin retrieved from Mrs. Grant's bedroom. Inside were the blackened remains of paper, mostly ash but not entirely illegible. Miss Marple leaned closer, peering with interest. One can often read more from what remains than from what is intact. Between them they made out fragments. Quarry, Edwin. Lady Beatrice knew, could not allow. The inspector straightened. "It won't change the outcome. The truth is already known." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed. "But it confirms something important. And what is that?" "That Mr. Bell was not acting out of anger or revenge," she said. "He was acting out of conscience. He wished the truth to be acknowledged, not weaponized." Inspector Pritchard replaced the bin carefully. "Mrs. Grant will be charged," he said quietly. "Manslaughter, most likely." Miss Marple nodded. A sad ending for a woman who believed she was holding the world together with her own hands. As they parted once more, Inspector Pritchard hesitated. "Do you ever find it weighs on you?" he asked, "seeing these things so clearly." Miss Marple smiled, her expression kind but firm. "If one looks long enough at people, Inspector, one learns that sorrow is universal. The danger lies not in seeing it, but in refusing to acknowledge it." This time, her departure from Little Dorling was uninterrupted. From the car window she watched the village recede into its familiar still. Curtains would be drawn, gossip exchanged in careful tones, conclusions softened for comfort. In time, the story would be reduced to something manageable. A tragedy, yes, but a contained one. Yet Miss Marple knew better. She knew that in quiet places the gravest dangers often arrived politely, bearing loyalty, silence, and a perfectly poured cup of tea. And she knew, too, that truth, however gently spoken, had a way of lingering long after the voices fell silent. She settled her handbag on her lap and allowed herself a small sigh. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly predictable and endlessly tragic. The train journey home gave Miss Marple time for reflection, though she did not allow herself the indulgence of sentiment. Fields slipped past the window in orderly succession, hedgerows clipped and familiar, the countryside wearing its most reassuring face. It occurred to her, not for the first time, how little landscapes revealed of the lives conducted quietly within them. At the first stop beyond Little Dorling, a familiar figure entered her carriage. Dr. Wright paused, surprised, then inclined his head. "Miss Marple, I wondered if I might find you here." "Do sit down," she said pleasantly. "Train journeys are always improved by conversation." He did so, removing his hat with a care that suggested he was still shedding the weight of recent days. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for seeing what the rest of us could not or would not." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Doctors see many things others avoid, Dr. Wright. You, above all, should know how often truth is obscured by fear." He looked out of the window. "Mrs. Grant's condition has stabilized." She asked after Lady Beatrice. "And did Lady Beatrice answer?" "Yes. She sent word that she forgives her." Miss Marple nodded. "Forgiveness is sometimes the last kindness we can offer." Dr. Wright hesitated. Is one thing that troubles me still. Mrs. Grant's attempt on her own life. Do you believe it was remorse, or another attempt at control?" Miss Marple considered. "Remorse, I think. Control had failed her by then. When order collapses, those who live by it often have nothing left to cling to." The train slowed, and Dr. Wright rose. "This is my stop. I doubt Little Dorling will ever feel quite the same again." "It never does," Miss Marple said gently. "But villages are resilient. They absorb tragedy, soften its edges, and carry on." After he left, Miss Marple retrieved her knitting, her needles clicking softly as the rhythm of the train resumed. She thought of Mr. Bell once more, of his quiet courage, his belief that truth need not be cruel to be effective. In a world that rewarded discretion over honesty, he had chosen conscience, knowing full well the risk. When she arrived home, the familiar comforts greeted her, the ticking clock in the hall, the neatly arranged cushions, the scent of lavender lingering in the air. Miss Marple set her bag aside and stood for a moment, listening to the silence. It was not an empty silence, she reflected, but a living one, full of memories, observations, and the unspoken understanding that life, in all its ordinariness, carried the seeds of both kindness and catastrophe. She poured herself a cup of tea, careful not to let it steep too long. As she settled into her chair, Miss Marple allowed herself one final thought before turning her attention back to her knitting. People often believed danger announced itself loudly, with drama and menace, but she knew better. It arrived quietly, cloaked in devotion and good intentions, asking only to be trusted, and it was for that reason, she knew, that there would always be work for someone willing to listen, patiently, unobtrusively, to what people said, and to what they so desperately tried not to. "Say it all." The kettle had just begun to murmur when the telephone rang. Miss Marple paused, hand resting lightly on its handle. Calls at that hour were unusual, and she had learned to respect such small disturbances. She crossed the room and lifted the receiver. "Miss Marple?" Inspector Pritchard's voice sounded thinner than before, stripped now of official briskness. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Inspector," she replied. "I was merely making tea." "I thought you might like to know," he said, after a brief hesitation, "that Mrs. Grant has made a full statement, clear, detailed. She accepted responsibility without hesitation." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "That will have cost her something." "Yes," he agreed. She spoke of Mr. Bell with affection, said he was the only one who ever truly saw her, that she could not bear the thought of him undoing everything she believed she had preserved. "Preservation can be a dangerous ambition," Miss Marple said quietly. "There's something else," the inspector continued. "Lady Beatrice has asked that Lucy Harper's death be formally reclassified. The inquest will be reopened, not to assign new blame, but to correct the record." Miss Marple smiled, though the inspector could not see it. Truth, at last, allowed its proper name. When the call ended, Miss Marple returned to the kettle and poured the water carefully, watching the color of the tea deepen to just the right shade. She carried the cup to her chair and sat, hands warming around the porcelain. Outside, the late afternoon light rested gently on the garden. Everything appeared as it should. Neat borders, trimmed hedges, a robin hopping confidently along the path. Order restored, one might have thought. Yet Miss Marple knew that order restored was never quite the same as order preserved. She thought of little Dorling, already smoothing the sharp edges of recent events. Soon people would say that Mrs. Grant had been overwrought, that Mr. Bell's death was tragic but unfortunate, that Lady Beatrice had borne everything with dignity. Edwin Hawthorne would become a cautionary tale, mentioned briefly and then less often. And Mr. Bell, quiet, loyal Mr. Bell, would be remembered as a good servant. Miss Marple sipped her tea. It was rarely the good servants, she reflected, who were truly seen. They listened, they noticed, they carried the weight of other people's secrets until that weight became unbearable. She set her cup aside and picked up her knitting once more, the familiar motion steadying her thoughts. There would be other villages, other drawing rooms, other cups of tea poured with perfectly innocent hands, and there would be other truths, waiting patiently for someone to notice the smallest inconsistency, the faintest hesitation, the moment when tea went cold before it was drunk. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Human nature, for all its sorrow and repetition, was not without hope. For as long as people observed, truly observed, there was a chance that quiet evils might be named, and that silence at last would be broken. The needles clicked softly. Outside the robins sang. The next morning arrived with a clarity that was almost too serene, the kind of day that could lull one into believing that misfortune belonged to yesterday alone. Miss Marple, however, knew better. She had learned over decades that tranquility often concealed the last quiet threads of a tangled web, and that the mind of a careful observer could find them even where others saw only sunlight and gentle breezes. She had barely set her teacup down when a note was delivered by the postman, folded in precise thirds, the handwriting unmistakable. It was from Lady Beatrice. Dear Miss Marple, I feel compelled to express my deepest gratitude. Your presence and you, our insight, have done more than any of us could have hoped. It is difficult to imagine Rosemere restored to calm without you. If it would not trouble you, I should be honored to have you visit once more in the weeks ahead. With sincere thanks, Beatrice Hawthorne. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she read it. There was relief in those words, but also a hint of weariness, an unspoken acknowledgement of the cost of concealed truths. She placed the note carefully in her purse and resumed her knitting, allowing herself a moment to savor the quiet victory of observation, deduction, and understanding. Later that morning, the local newspaper arrived. Miss Marple skimmed the headline, Butler's death reveals long-buried family secret, and the accompanying article. Facts were, as usual, simplified. The nuanced web of loyalty, fear, and conscience had been reduced to something digestible for the public, a scandal, a crime, a brief mention of poison. Mr. Bell's courage, Mrs. Grant's desperate miscalculation, and Lady Beatrice's restrained grief were largely invisible in print. Yet Miss Marple did not mind. Public comprehension rarely mattered. The truth had been acknowledged where it was most necessary, in the lives of those directly involved, where it had always been potent and immediate. By mid-morning, she received a visit from Dr. Wright. He brought news of Mrs. Grant's slow but steady recovery. She seems calmer now, he said, offering a faint smile, more reflective than defensive. It is astonishing how even guilt can give way to understanding. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze following the movement of a sparrow hopping along the window ledge. A woman who has confronted herself is a different creature entirely. One hopes she will use the chance wisely. Dr. Wright hesitated, then asked the question she knew would come. Do you ever tire of this work, Miss Marple? Of seeing the darkness behind polite faces? She set her knitting down, fingers resting on the soft yarn. One does not tire, she said gently. One merely becomes more aware, and one becomes grateful for the small, enduring kindnesses, the courage of a faithful servant, the honesty of a confession. the restraint of someone who might have harmed others out of fear. He nodded, as though he understood, and departed shortly thereafter, leaving her once more in the quiet sanctuary of her home. Miss Marple returned to her window, gazing at the familiar garden where sunlight painted patterns across the lawn. The robin had returned, its song sharp and insistent, as though reminding her that life, messy, moral and complex, continued to unfold regardless of yesterday's shadows. Her knitting needles moved with steady rhythm, the soft click a metronome to her thoughts. She reflected on little Dorling, on Rosemere, on the delicate balance between loyalty and fear, secrecy and revelation. She knew that the village would settle into its routines once more. Gossip would resume its familiar dance, and life would appear ordinary again. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, Miss Marple was certain the echoes of yesterday's truths would linger, a quiet, subtle caution to those who believed silence could protect them. And she, as always, would be ready to notice. The needles clicked, the sun shifted across the floor, and the world moved quietly on. But for those who had learned, in a single afternoon, the cost of hidden truths, nothing would ever quite be the same again. The weeks that followed passed in a gentle, measured rhythm. Little Dorling resumed its familiar routines, the market square filled again with chatter and laughter, and Rosemere, though quieter than before, regained a sense of ordinary life. Lady Beatrice spent long hours in her garden, tending roses and box hedges with meticulous care, while Edwin Hawthorne quietly removed himself from village life, leaving only faint echoes of his impulsive youth behind. Miss Marple received a courteous note from Lady Beatrice, inviting her to visit once more, not as a detective summoned by calamity, but as a friend, someone who had quietly understood the hidden currents of Rosemere. She accepted, curious to observe how a household might reconcile with the truths that had once threatened to unravel it entirely. On her arrival, the house was serene, the air fragrant with late summer blooms. Lady Beatrice greeted her with a warm, though subdued, smile, leading her through the familiar corridors, with a calm that seemed almost deliberate after the turmoil of recent weeks. "I wanted you to see how matters have settled," Lady Beatrice said as they entered the drawing-room. "Not perfectly. Perfection is impossible, but with honesty now established, peace seems attainable." Miss Marple's eyes swept over the room, noting the small changes, a rearranged tea service, photographs replaced in new frames, and the absence of the desk chair that had witnessed so much. The silence was no longer oppressive. It carried the quiet dignity of a house that had endured, adapted, and in some measure healed. "And Mrs. Grant?" Miss Marple asked softly. "She is recovering steadily," Lady Beatrice replied. "She has expressed sincere regret, and though she must face the consequences of her actions, I believe she will emerge with a deeper understanding of herself and her duties. It is not a total redemption, but it is the beginning of one." Miss Marple nodded. "Understanding is often the first step toward restraint." They moved to the garden, where the late afternoon light fell in long shafts through the trees. The roses were carefully pruned, their colors bright against the fading green of the lawn. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and the air was filled with the soft murmur of bees. Lady Beatrice paused near a small stone bench. "I had feared the house would never feel safe again," she admitted, "but now it feels guarded, not by secrecy but by memory, by the knowledge that what is hidden can always find a way to be revealed." Miss Marple smiled, picking up a fallen petal. "And it is precisely that knowledge which keeps people cautious, careful, and, ultimately, humane. For the most dangerous things in life are rarely wild or loud. They are small, subtle, quietly carried." Lady Beatrice's eyes softened. "You understood that, did you?" "I try," Miss Marple said gently. "I have long believed that people reveal their truths, even when they think they hide them. One need only listen carefully, observe attentively, and remember what they do not say." They walked slowly through the garden, speaking of lighter matters, of seasonal flowers, and of village events. The tension of past weeks gradually lifted, replaced by the ordinary rhythms of life, but with an added depth, an awareness that beneath calm surfaces the human heart was always observing, always calculating, always feeling. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the garden, Miss Marple knew it was time to depart. Lady Beatrice saw her to the door, the gesture of farewell warm and sincere. "Thank you," Lady Beatrice said quietly, "for seeing clearly when no one else could." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is often the unseen details that matter most, and in Little Dorling, as elsewhere, they are plentiful." The carriage awaited, and as it rolled away, Miss Marple took one last look at Rosemere, its windows catching the last light of day. The house had endured, not unscathed, but intact in the ways that mattered. And nature, she reflected, could be both fragile and formidable. And for those willing to notice, willing to observe patiently, quietly, without judgment, there would always be a chance to untangle the knotted threads of fear, loyalty, and hidden truths before they unraveled entirely. The carriage carried her back toward her own quiet home, her knitting safely in her lap, the world moving steadily onward, carrying with it the weight of all that had been discovered and all that remained unspoken. As the carriage rolled along the familiar country lane, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to drift gently, as though following a thread of wool. Little Dorling had returned to its surface calm, yet she knew the village had been subtly altered. An undercurrent of caution now threaded through the ordinary interactions, a quiet respect for truths once buried and finally brought to light. Her arrival at home was greeted by the steady, comforting ticking of her grandfather clock. The garden outside was brushed with the soft gold of late afternoon sun, and a robin hopped along the path, calling insistently, as though aware of the unfolding day and eager to mark its presence. Settling into her favorite chair with her knitting, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh of satisfaction. Events had resolved in ways that were both inevitable and instructive. Human nature had been revealed in all its complexity, the loyalty that could turn dangerous, the courage that could inspire, and the fear that could mislead even the most devoted. Yet, even in the quiet of her sitting room, she could not help but consider the ripples that would extend far beyond Rosemere. Stories, once set in motion, rarely stopped at the edges of one household. Words, confessions, and regrets had a way of traveling. Through whispered conversations, letters, and recollections shared over tea in neighboring villages. She sipped her tea and considered Mrs. Grant, now recovering under medical supervision, facing the consequences of her desperate attempt to preserve a fragile order. Her heart went out to the woman, not in judgment but in understanding. Fear and devotion, when unchecked, could be as lethal as malice. And yet, with time and reflection, even those impulses could be tempered. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. It was Emily Carter, carrying a small basket of freshly baked scones, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. "Miss Marple," Emily said quietly, "I thought you might like some tea to go with your knitting. The house has been quieter, but not quite the same, since you left." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Thank you, Emily. That is very thoughtful." As they arranged the scones on a small tray, Emily hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever think about it all? About what happened at Rosemere?" Miss Marple looked out the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the garden. "I do," she admitted. "Not with fear, but with care. The danger is not in remembering, but in forgetting. Those who observe carefully, who listen attentively, ensure that mistakes are less likely to be repeated." Emily nodded, seeming to draw comfort from that. She poured the tea, and they sat together, the soft clink of china accompanying their quiet conversation. Outside, the robin sang its brief, sharp tune, a reminder that life continued, insistently, regardless of the past. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the rhythm soothing, steady. The world beyond her window carried on, filled with secrets, silences, and the occasional whispered confession, and she, ever watchful, would be ready when those quiet truths surfaced again, for she understood, better than most, that the human heart, loyal, fearful, devoted, flawed, always left traces, And it was in noticing those traces, in connecting the subtle threads, that the ordinary could reveal the extraordinary, and justice, in its gentle, patient form, could quietly be served. The weeks after Miss Marple's visit to Rosemere passed with the gentle rhythm of autumn settling over the countryside. Leaves turned gold and copper, drifting silently to the ground, and the air carried the faint chill of approaching winter. Little Dorling resumed its quiet life. The market resumed its chatter. Children played along the village lanes, and the church bells rang for services as they had for centuries. Yet beneath this ordinary veneer, the village had absorbed the lessons of recent events, the subtle imprint of truths long concealed, now gently acknowledged. Mrs. Grant, having recovered her strength, was relocated under careful supervision, facing the consequences of her actions but also finding the first threads of understanding and contrition. Lady Beatrice, freed from the immediate weight of hidden scandals, returned to her garden and household with a steadier, more measured presence, carrying forward the awareness that loyalty, however well-intended, could become perilous when entwined with fear. Edwin Hawthorne's absence remained a quiet echo, a reminder of impulsive choices and the fragile nature of privilege. Miss Marple, back in her own home, found solace in the familiar routines of daily life, the ticking of the clock, the scent of lavender, and the comforting rhythm of her knitting. Yet even as she settled into quiet reflection, she knew the world was filled with households like Rosemere, where human hearts carried secrets in silence, and where devotion and fear could collide in ways subtle but dangerous. She thought of Mr. Bell, whose conscience had compelled him to act despite the risks, of Lucy Harper, whose voice had been stifled too soon, and of Mrs. Grant, whose misguided devotion had threatened what she sought to protect. Each of them had left traces, and Miss Marple had traced them with the patience and care that defined her work. Outside, the robin called insistently, leaping from branch to branch, a reminder that life, in all its complexity, continued regardless of the shadows that had passed. Miss Marple smiled faintly, returning to her knitting, the soft click of needles marking both the passage of time and the quiet constancy of observation. Human nature, she reflected, was rarely simple. It could be gentle, loyal, fearful and flawed all at once. And while the world might never fully recognize the subtle truths hidden in ordinary lives, those who observed patiently, the quiet, unassuming observers like herself, would ensure that the lessons, however small, were not lost. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over her garden. Miss Marple took a final sip of her tea, set down the cup and leaned back in her chair, content. The world beyond her window moved steadily onward, carrying with it both the quiet perils of human hearts and the enduring hope that, through careful observation and gentle understanding, truth might always find its way. And in that knowledge Miss Marple found both peace and purpose.